that needing people makes you weak, that caring what they think is a character flaw, that the moment someone's opinion affects you, you've lost. But what if the real trap isn't dependence on others? What if it's the exhausting performance of pretending you don't care at all? Emotional independence isn't what most people think it is. It's not building walls, it's not becoming untouchable, and it's definitely not convincing yourself that other people's reactions don't matter. That's not strength. That's just another cage painted to look like freedom. Here's what actually happens when you chase that kind of independence. You start measuring every interaction by how little it moves you. Someone criticizes you. You force yourself not to flinch. Someone praises you. You dismiss it as meaningless. You train yourself to be so detached that eventually you're not present anymore. You're performing detachment, and performance is exhausting. The Stoics understood something most modern self-help misses entirely. They didn't aim for emotional numbness. They aimed for emotional clarity. There's a difference. One makes you cold, the other makes you calm. One cuts you off from life, the other lets you move through it without being controlled by every shift in temperature. Think about the last time someone said something that stung. Maybe it was a passing comment, maybe a deliberate jab. Your first instinct was probably to either lash out or shut down completely. Fight or freeze, but both reactions hand your power to the other person. Both say the same thing. What you just said has complete authority over my internal state. That's the real problem. Not that you felt something, but that you gave the feeling immediate command over your next move. Emotional independence starts when you stop confusing feeling with obeying. You can notice anger without speaking from it. You can feel hurt without making it your identity. You can register disappointment without letting it rewrite your entire narrative. The emotion shows up, you see it, you acknowledge it, then you decide what happens next. Most people skip that middle step. They go straight from stimulus to reaction, convinced that speed equals authenticity. But authenticity isn't reacting faster, it's responding more honestly. And honesty requires a pause. Consider how much energy you waste trying to control what others think of you. The careful edits, the strategic silence, the calculated responses. You're not being independent. You're being hypervigilant. You're so worried about their perception that you've handed them the pen to your story. They don't even know they're holding it. Real independence looks different. It's knowing that someone can dislike you and your worth doesn't shift. It's hearing criticism and asking if there's truth in it without your ego screaming over the answer. It's being praised and feeling grateful without needing it to survive. You're not indifferent to people, you're just not imprisoned by them. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than reality. And nowhere is that more obvious than in how we anticipate judgment. You replay conversations that haven't happened yet. You defend yourself against accusations no one's made. You build entire arguments in your head against people who aren't even thinking about you. All of that is dependence. You've made their potential opinions so powerful they don't even need to voice them. But here's where it gets interesting. The path to emotional independence isn't about caring less. It's about caring more precisely. You stop scattering your concern across every possible opinion and start focusing it on what actually aligns with just move. And that movement has a different quality to it. Someone insults you and you don't immediately need to correct the record. You assess whether there's something useful in what they said. If there is, you take it. If there isn't, you let it pass. No performance, no pretending it didn't land. Just a clear-eyed evaluation of whether this particular piece of feedback serves your growth. That's not detachment, that's discernment. The people who've mastered this don't seem untouchable, they seem present. They're engaged in conversations without being desperate for specific outcomes. They listen without needing to defend. They share without requiring validation. And when they walk away from something that doesn't serve them, it's not dramatic. It's just done. You can see it in how they handle conflict. There's no urgency to win, no need to have the last word. They state their position clearly, hear yours, and let the outcome be what it is. If you agree, fine. If you don't, also fine. Their internal stability isn't on trial. This is what emotional independence actually builds. Not isolation, not superiority. Just a centered presence that doesn't need external chaos to quiet down before it can function. You become someone who can stand in the middle of noise and still hear yourself think. And once you find that, once you really settle into it, something shifts in how you relate to everything else. The relationships that survive this shift become deeper because they're no longer transactional. You're not there to extract validation. You're there because you choose to be. And that choice, made freely without the weight of need behind it, creates something most people never experience. But getting there requires facing something most would rather avoid. You have to look directly at why you need approval in the first place. What you'll find beneath the need is usually the same thing. Fear. Not the dramatic kind that makes you run from danger, but the subtle kind that makes you shrink in rooms full of people who haven't even noticed you yet. Fear that if they really saw you, the unfiltered version, they'd find something lacking. So you adjust, you soften edges, you laugh at jokes that aren't funny, you nod along with opinions you don't hold, and every time you do that, you reinforce the belief that the real you isn't enough. That's the cycle. The more you perform, the more you prove to yourself that authenticity is risky. And the more you avoid that risk, the more disconnected you become from who you actually are. Until one day you look in the mirror and realize you're not sure which version is real anymore. Breaking that cycle doesn't happen through affirmations or pretending you suddenly don't care what anyone thinks. It happens through exposure. Small moments where you let the real opinion slip out and notice that the world doesn't end. Where you set a boundary and discover that the relationship either adjusts or it wasn't built to last anyway. Where you stop laughing at the joke and realize the silence doesn't kill you. Each time you do this, you collect evidence. Not that people will always approve, but that you can survive their disapproval. And more than survive, you can stay intact. That's what shifts the foundation. You stop needing the approval because you've proven to yourself that life continues without it. Not in theory, in practice. Through lived experience that rewrites the internal script telling you that rejection equals annihilation. It doesn't. Rejection just means someone sees things differently, and their difference doesn't have to become your crisis. Emotional independence isn't a permanent state you achieve and then coast on. It's a practice, a daily choice to return to your own center instead of drifting toward whatever external force is pulling hardest. Some days that's easy. Other days you'll catch yourself mid-performance, realize what you're doing, and have to consciously pull back. That's not failure, that's awareness. And awareness is the first requirement for change. You start noticing the pattern, how your mood shifts based on someone's tone, how you edit your words before speaking to make them more palatable, how you check reactions before deciding if what you said was okay. Once you see it, you can't unsee it, and that visibility creates choice. You can keep doing it, but now it's conscious. And conscious behavior is much harder to maintain when it conflicts with who you're trying to become. The transition feels awkward at first. You're used to reading rooms, adjusting in real time, managing everyone's comfort, including your own. Now you're attempting something different, staying steady, letting your presence be what it is without constant recalibration. People notice, some appreciate it, others find it unsettling because your stability highlights their own dependence. That's not your problem to fix. You're not responsible for making everyone comfortable with your growth. What you are responsible for is not weaponizing this newfound independence. Because there's a version of this that tips into arrogance, where you start treating every boundary as a power move, where you confuse emotional independence with emotional unavailability, where you stop caring about impact altogether under the banner of authenticity. That's not strength. That's overcorrection. Real emotional independence includes awareness of how you affect others. It just doesn't let that awareness control you. You can acknowledge that your honesty might sting while still choosing honesty. You can recognize that your boundary might disappoint someone while still holding the boundary. The difference is you're not doing it to hurt them. You're doing it to honor yourself. And you trust that people who truly value you will either understand or eventually come to terms with it. The ones who can't weren't aligned with you anyway. They were aligned with the version of you that prioritized their comfort over your integrity. Losing those connections isn't loss, it's clarity. It's the natural pruning that happens when you stop trying to be everything to everyone. And yes, it can feel lonely at first, because you're used to a certain level of engagement, even if that engagement was performative. Now there's space, quiet, room to hear your own thoughts without the constant background noise of managing perceptions. That space is where you find out who you actually are, not who you've been trained to be, not who you think you should be, but who you are when no one's watching, when there's no audience to perform for, when the only person you need to satisfy is yourself. And the strange thing is, once you get comfortable in that space, once you stop fearing it and start inhabiting it, you become more magnetic. Not because you're trying to attract anyone, but because authenticity has a frequency that people recognize even if they can't name it. You stop chasing and suddenly people are curious. They want to know how you stay so calm, how you handle criticism without crumbling, how you maintain boundaries without being cruel. The answer is simpler than they expect. You just stopped abandoning yourself every time someone seemed uncomfortable with your presence. You chose you, not in a selfish way, in a sustainable way. because you finally understood that you can't pour from an empty cup, and every time you betrayed yourself for approval, you emptied a little more. Now you're filling it back up, slowly, steadily, with choices that align, with boundaries that protect, with presence that doesn't require external validation to feel real. This is where emotional independence stops being a concept and becomes a lived experience, where you move through the world differently because your relationship with yourself has fundamentally shifted. You stop performing stability and start living it. That shift isn't loud. Most people won't notice the moment it happens, but you will. You'll feel it in how you respond when plans fall apart, in how you handle being misunderstood without needing to explain yourself into exhaustion, in how you can sit with someone's disappointment and not absorb it as evidence of your failure. This is the territory most self-help content skips over. The part where emotional independence isn't about building walls. It's about knowing which bridges to cross and which to leave standing but unused. You don't burn connections out of spite. You just stop forcing yourself across them when every step feels like betrayal of your own knowing. There's a maturity in that. A quiet discernment that comes from repeatedly choosing yourself and realizing the world didn't end. People adjusted, some left, others stayed and respected the new terms. And you discovered that the ones who stayed are the ones worth keeping anyway, because they're not attached to the version of you that shrinks. They're interested in the version that grows, even when that growth creates distance from old patterns, even when it means they have to grow too or step back. That's the real filter, not cruelty, just clarity about who can walk with you as you become more of yourself. And this doesn't mean you become cold. Some people mistake emotional independence for detachment. They think it requires shutting down feeling. But that's the opposite of what happens. When you're no longer dependent on external validation, you actually feel more. You just don't let those feelings dictate your choices the way you used to. You can feel hurt and still hold your boundary. You can feel disappointed and still respect someone's decision. You can feel lonely and still choose solitude over bad company. The emotions don't vanish. They just stop running the show. You become the director instead of the actor reacting to every shift in the script. That's power. Not the kind that dominates others, the kind that governs yourself. And it's built through repetition, through choosing aligned action even when emotion screams for something else, through sitting with discomfort instead of numbing it, through letting people be wrong about you without mounting a defense. Each time you do this, you strengthen something internal, a core that doesn't need constant external reinforcement to stay solid. Most people never build this. They spend their entire lives outsourcing their emotional stability to relationships, achievements, substances, distractions, anything to avoid sitting alone with themselves and realizing they're enough, that the validation they've been chasing was always an inside job. But once you know that, once you've tasted what it feels like to be your own source, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to performing for approval without feeling the weight of the compromise. It becomes physically uncomfortable to abandon yourself. Your body starts rejecting it before your mind even catches up. That's when you know it's integrated. When self-betrayal feels worse than someone's disapproval. When losing yourself feels more painful than losing the connection. when you'd rather stand alone in your truth than sit surrounded by people who only like the edited version. This is where most people get scared, because it sounds isolating. And sometimes it is. There's a period where you're rebuilding your foundation, and it feels like you're the only one doing this work. Like everyone else is still playing the old game, and you're the only one who opted out. That phase is real. It's necessary. It's the bridge between who you were and who you're becoming. But it's not permanent. Because once you stabilize in this new way of being, you start attracting different people. Not because you're trying to, but because your frequency changed. You're no longer resonating with dynamics built on performance and people-pleasing. You're resonating with authenticity, with depth, with people who've done their own work and recognize it in you. Those connections feel different, easier, less exhausting, because there's no pretense to maintain. You show up as you are, they show up as they are, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, you part ways without drama. No one's trying to force anything, no one's trying to fix anyone, just two people being themselves and seeing if that creates something worth continuing. That's what becomes possible on the other side of emotional independence. Not isolation, but connection built on solid ground instead of need. You're not looking for someone to complete you. You're already whole. You're looking for someone who complements your wholeness, someone who adds to your life without being responsible for your emotional state. That's a radically different starting point, and it changes everything. How you date, how you work, how you show up in friendships, because you're no longer auditioning, you're just being and trusting that the right people will appreciate that. The wrong ones will filter themselves out. And that's not a loss. It's efficiency. Life gets simpler when you stop trying to be everything to everyone. When you accept that some people won't like you, and that's data, not devastation. When you realize their opinion doesn't have to become your identity. You get to just be. Flawed, human, evolving, and completely okay with all of it. That's the freedom nobody talks about, not the freedom from responsibility, but the freedom from needing everyone's approval to feel valid, from needing every situation to go perfectly to feel secure, from needing constant reassurance that you're doing it right. You just are. And that's enough. And when you reach that point, something unexpected happens. You stop being afraid of change, not because change becomes comfortable, but because you realize you're no longer defined by what stays the same. Most people cling to consistency because they've built their entire identity around external markers. Same job, same routine, same people, same version of themselves they've been performing for years. And when any of that shifts, they panic. Because if those things change, who are they? But when your center is internal, change becomes less threatening. You're not losing yourself when circumstances shift. You're just navigating new terrain with the same core intact. That's the difference. You can move cities, switch careers, end relationships, start new ones, and still recognize yourself in the mirror. Because you're not the role you play, you're the awareness behind it. The observer who remains constant even as the scenery changes. This is why people who've done deep inner work seem so adaptable. It's not that they don't feel loss or discomfort when things change, they do. But they don't interpret it as a threat to their existence. It's just life moving, and they move with it without the need to control instead of break. And that flexibility, that's what resilience actually is. Not toughness, not grinding through everything with clenched fists, but the ability to stay grounded in yourself while the world around you shifts. To be rooted enough that you don't get swept away, but fluid enough that you don't snap under pressure. The Stoics understood this better than most modern philosophies. They didn't teach detachment from life. They taught engagement without dependency. Love people, but don't need them to complete you. Pursue goals, but don't let failure destroy you. Care deeply, but don't let outcomes dictate your worth. That's the balance most people never find. They swing between caring too much and shutting down completely, between clinging desperately and running away. But there's a middle path, one where you're fully invested in your life without being enslaved by it, where you give everything you have without giving yourself away. And here's the part that sounds contradictory but isn't. The more independent you become emotionally, the more capacity you have for genuine intimacy. Because intimacy requires vulnerability, and you can't be truly vulnerable if you're terrified of what happens when someone sees the real you. That fear creates performance. It creates masks. It creates relationships where both people are pretending and wondering why they feel so alone together. But when you're no longer dependent on someone else's validation to feel okay, vulnerability stops being terrifying. It's just honesty. You share yourself not because you need them to approve, but because you want to be known. And if they can't handle that, you don't crumble. You just recognize it's not a match, and you move forward. That level of emotional maturity is rare. Most people never get there because they never question the baseline assumption that their worth comes from outside. They spend their whole lives trying to earn something they already have, trying to become worthy when they were never unworthy to begin with. The prison was always imaginary, but it felt real because everyone around them was living in the same illusion, reinforcing it, rewarding it, making it seem like the only way to survive. Breaking free doesn't mean you become cold or indifferent. It means you become clear. You can see the game without needing to play it. You can participate in the world without being consumed by it. You can care about people's opinions without being controlled by them. It's a subtle but profound shift from reactive to responsive, from dependent to grounded, from performing to being. And once you make that shift, you start to notice how much energy you were wasting. All those hours spent overthinking what someone thought, replaying conversations, editing yourself in real time, worrying about how you came across. That energy doesn't disappear, it gets redirected into things that actually matter, into building something real, into relationships that don't require constant maintenance because they're built on truth instead of pretense, into work that reflects who you actually are instead of who you think you need to be. You also start to see the people around you differently, not with judgment but with clarity. You can see when someone's operating from fear, when they're performing, when they're seeking validation, and you feel compassion for it because you've been there. But you also don't get pulled back in. You don't take on their anxiety. You don't absorb their need for approval. You just hold space for them while staying anchored in yourself. That's what it means to be present without being porous, to care without caring, to to support without sacrificing your own stability. This is the work nobody told you about, not the external achievements, not the accolades or milestones, but the internal restructuring, the slow, unglamorous process of learning to validate yourself, to comfort yourself, to trust yourself. It's not a weekend workshop, it's not a quick fix, it's a daily practice. Some days you'll nail it, other days you'll slip back into old patterns. That's part of it. Growth isn't linear, but every time you choose yourself over the performance, you strengthen that foundation. You make it a little easier the next time, and eventually it becomes your default. Not because you're trying, but because you've rebuilt your nervous system around a different truth. You're enough. Not because of what you do, not because of who approves, just because you exist. That's the foundation everything else gets built on. And once it's there, nothing can take it away. You start to walk differently when you're not carrying that weight anymore. Not louder, not with more bravado, just steadier. There's a quietness to it that people notice but can't quite name. You're less reactive, less desperate to fill silence, less concerned with being misunderstood because you understand yourself. And that shift, that internal recalibration, changes everything about how you move through the world. Most people spend their lives trying to control their external environment. They think if they can just get the right job, the right partner, the right group of friends, then they'll finally feel secure. But security was never out there. It was always an inside job. And the moment you realize that, you stop trying to rearrange the world and start rearranging your relationship to it. This doesn't mean you become passive, it means you become strategic. You stop wasting energy on battles that don't matter. You stop defending yourself to people who've already made up their minds. You stop trying to convince anyone of your value because you're no longer asking for their permission to exist. That's not arrogance, that's clarity, and clarity is the most disarming thing you can carry. People will test it. They'll poke at the boundaries you've set. They'll see if you'll fold under pressure the way you used to. And when you don't, when you hold the line with calm instead of aggression, something shifts in the dynamic. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped negotiating with chaos. You stopped participating in the drama. And drama can't sustain itself without two players. There's a particular kind of freedom that comes from no longer needing to win every argument. You can let someone think they're right. You can walk away from a conversation without having the last word. You can be misunderstood and not feel compelled to correct the record because your peace isn't tied to their perception. Your worth isn't up for debate. And once that sinks in, you realize how much energy you've been bleeding into pointless conflicts. The world will keep spinning. People will keep projecting. Situations will keep arising that could pull you off center if you let them. But you won't. Not because you're perfect, but because you've trained yourself to return, to pause, to ask the question that changes everything. Is this mine to carry? And most of the time the answer is no, it never was. You'll still care about people, you'll still show up, you'll still invest in relationships and work and causes that matter. But you'll do it from overflow, not from depletion. You'll give because you want to, not because you're trying to earn something. And that changes the quality of everything you touch. People feel the difference. They can't always articulate it, but they know when someone's operating from wholeness instead of lack. This is what Stoicism was always pointing toward. Not detachment, not coldness, but sovereignty. The ability to stand in the middle of chaos and remain unmoved, not because nothing affects you, but because you've learned to observe without absorbing, to feel without fracturing, to engage without losing yourself in the process. The work doesn't end. There's no final destination where you've arrived and never have to check in again. But it gets easier. The patterns become familiar. You catch yourself slipping into old habits faster. You course correct without self-judgment. You treat yourself the way you treat someone you deeply respect. With patience, with honesty, with the kind of compassion that doesn't coddle but doesn't condemn either. And slowly, almost without noticing, you become the person you needed when you were younger. The one who doesn't flinch. The one who doesn't need constant reassurance. The one who can hold space for uncertainty without trying to control it. You become the anchor, not for others necessarily, but for yourself. And that's the most radical thing you can do in a world that profits from your instability. So if you've been waiting for permission to stop performing, this is it. If you've been wondering when it's okay to step off the treadmill of approval seeking, the answer is now. Not because you've earned it, not because you've finally done enough, but because the entire premise was flawed from the start. You were never meant to spend your life auditioning. You were meant to live it. And living it means making peace with the fact that not everyone will understand. Some will misread your boundaries as coldness, your self-respect as arrogance, your clarity as rigidity. Let them. Their interpretation doesn't change what's true, and what's true is this. You are not obligated to shrink so others feel comfortable. You are not required to explain yourself into exhaustion. You are allowed to exist fully, unapologetically, without needing a single person to validate that existence. That's the shift. That's the work. And it's not glamorous. It won't get you applause, but it will give you something far more valuable. Your life back. Not the performance, not the highlight reel, but the real, messy, imperfect, deeply human experience of being alive without constantly wondering if you're doing it right. You are. You always were. And the moment you stop asking that question is the moment everything changes. Not because the world shifted, but because you finally stopped waiting for it to. You'll know you've crossed over when someone's anger doesn't become your emergency. When criticism lands and you can sit with it long enough to extract what's useful without letting the rest corrode your sense of self. When you can watch someone walk away and feel sadness without spiraling into stories about what it means about you. That's the marker, not that you stop feeling, but that feeling stops owning you. And here's what nobody prepared you for. It gets lonely before it gets liberating. There's a stretch where you're learning this new language and everyone around you is still speaking the old one, where you're setting boundaries and people are calling it selfishness. Where you're choosing yourself and it looks like abandonment to those who benefited from your self-betrayal. That gap is uncomfortable, but it's temporary. Because the people who are supposed to be in your life will either rise to meet you or they won't. And both outcomes give you clarity. What you're building isn't a fortress, it's a foundation. One that doesn't crumble when someone doesn't text back. One that doesn't crack when plans change. one that holds you steady when the world around you is anything but. And once it's built, once it's truly solid, you'll realize something strange. You're not less connected to people, you're more connected. Because now you're showing up as yourself instead of as whoever you think they need you to be. And that authenticity creates the kind of intimacy performance never could. This isn't about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. And whole doesn't mean flawless, it means integrated. It means you've stopped abandoning parts of yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed for your fullness. It means you've learned to hold your own hand through the hard parts instead of waiting for someone else to notice you're struggling. That's power, not the kind that dominates, the kind that endures, the kind that doesn't need an audience to be real.